They were a high society couple with a seemingly storybook romance.
They fell in love. They made plans to live happily ever after.
Their wedding, they came in a big white chauffeured limousine, and they both marched in with these white fur coats.
But their marriage would be ripped apart by a nightmarish crime.
This was a violent type of homicide.
It was an attack that the killer wanted to make sure the victim was dead.
The search for the killer will stretch across multiple continents and unearth a Pandora's box of secrets and scandals.
There were a significant amount of emails about a love affair.
The only people that would know that is the killer and the police.
And at the heart of it all is a blood-soaked betrayal rooted in lust and greed.
I see this as a classic film noir with a femme fatale who is extremely narcissistic, no empathy, no conscience.
This is a methodical, evil person.
Relationships end. People don't need to die for it.
New Brunswick is one of 4 Atlantic provinces on the eastern coast of Canada. New Brunswick is also where Alan Lantain was born and raised. His close friend, Grazia Mazzi, first met Alan when they worked together in the catering industry.
Alan was a person that was always full of energy, a person that bring some light into the room.
But growing up in the small New Brunswick town of St. John wasn't always easy for Alan.
He was a solitary child. He didn't have a lot of friends. He never connected directly these things to the fact that he was gay.
Eager to spread his wings, Alan moved to Toronto shortly after graduating high school.
Toronto is a very multicultural city, and there is not so much judgment here about who you are or who you hang out with. When he came here, he was able to be who the person was. His personality came out.
For the next 6 years, Alan flourished in Toronto, working as both a caterer and restaurant server while taking classes at a business school. Alan's close friend, Jarvis Belding, watched Alan's career take off following his graduation.
He graduated from the Ontario School of Business. His major was in, which would be accounting. Most weekends he would work in the hospitality industry, as I did as well. He was fun to be around. He was easy to work with.
Things kept getting better for Alan in 1997 when he landed a coveted accounting job with a national restaurant chain. Then in 2004, Alan, now 46, met the man who would change his life forever. 29-year-old attorney Demitry Papasouteriou.
He told me that he met him at a bus stop and he liked this guy and he started to talk to him.
Demitry Papasouteriou was born in Athens, Greece, and at some point he moved to Toronto where he studied law.
Demitry's former colleague, Calvin Barry, recalls how talented Demitry was as an attorney.
He was an extremely academic, bright person. Young, attractive. Not just a lawyer, but quite a gifted lawyer. He was this whiz kid. I think he had a degree when he was 16. It's phenomenal. He must have skipped about 2 or 3 grades.
Despite their 17-year age difference, it was clear to Alan's friends that he'd fallen hard for the younger man.
Demitry was this glamorous younger person. He dressed in flashy blonde hair, boyish looking. He wanted someone to take care of him. Alan was a very loving, trusting guy.
To his friend's surprise, Alan announced he and Demitry were getting married just 4 months after they met.
I went to his wedding. They came in a big white chauffeured limousine, and they both marched in with these white fur coats, almost like Elton John kind of stuff.
As the couple settled into a new life together, they purchased a house in Toronto's up-and-coming Ossington neighborhood.
Alan loved that house. He adored it, and he spent a lot of money fixing up the place and doing additions to it. His house was his palace.
It became a showpiece home. Alan was pouring the money into it because Demitry spent a lot of time studying and going to school, but he didn't have a working income.
That same year, Alan's career took an unexpected shift when the corporation where he worked closed their Toronto headquarters. Alan found a job as a bookkeeper, but at a much reduced salary. To make up for the lost income, he was forced to take on a second job.
He worked as an accounting bookkeeper for the University of Toronto, but he also worked his ass off as a caterer. He was a workaholic.
Then, 4 years into their marriage, Alan and Demitry's relationship faced a new challenge when Demitry's career took him overseas.
He actually went to Switzerland, where he was studying as a PhD student in law at the University of Lucerne.
With their renovations still in full swing, Alan made the difficult decision to stay behind in Toronto. But the couple made plans to rendezvous every few months until Demitry finished his new degree.
The plan was that Demitry was studying in Switzerland, and then he was supposed to come back and work in Toronto.
But Alan and Demitry's plans for the future would soon be rocked by an unforeseen tragedy. March 3rd, 2011. At 4 p.m., Alan's close friend Grazia Mazzi shows up at his home to check on him. Grazia is concerned Alan hasn't returned any of her calls, which is unusual.
My concern was that he maybe didn't feel well. So I went with a taxi there. Everything was black. I mean, there were no lights inside. I went into the backyard and I checked the car, and the car was there.
She goes back home again and waits until the following day. And she starts to call Alan at work. And she eventually gets someone on the phone who she knows who works with Alan. And they tell her, oh, he didn't show up for work today. Very unusual. And he didn't call in sick. And so she immediately goes back to the house and she phones 911.
When police arrive at Alan's home, Grazia is waiting on them in the driveway.
This policeman arrived. I explained briefly what was the issue.
With everything that the officer knew at the time, the information from Grazia, and the fact that, Alan didn't show up for work, not answering the phone, we made a decision at that point, we're gonna go in.
The officer goes around back. She actually kicks in the back door, and she can see what appears to be a person lying on the floor by the front door.
The moment that she opened the kitchen door, I saw Alan face down on the floor.
She goes in to investigate, and he's obviously deceased.
I started to cry, and the policeman came back to me and said, you cannot go inside. There's nothing else can be done for your friend.
Coming up, detectives try to piece together what happened to Alan.
He has obvious signs of injury in and around his head.
And a mysterious visitor at his workplace draws suspicion.
In the part where you're supposed to write the cause of death, he wrote bludgeoning.
The only people that would know that is the killer and the police.
While performing a welfare check at the home of 49-year-old accountant Alan Lantain, Toronto police have just made a disturbing discovery.
Alan's found deceased on the floor. He has obvious signs of injury in and around his head.
Toronto detectives Tam Bowie and Leslie Dunkley arrive on the scene moments later.
There was a large pool of blood. We went through a number of different theories. Did he fall down the stairs? But on the wall, by the staircase and by the front doors is blood splatter. And some injury to the back of Alan's head, which would indicate that there was some blunt force trauma. So ultimately, we determined he was hit very hard and multiple times.
Alan was found in the front foyer of his home. He is wearing his winter jacket. He's wearing winter-type shoes. He has gloves on, except for he's removed his right glove. And his keys are in his other gloved hand. They're wondering if it was like a break and enter that he had interrupted coming home, or a robbery in progress.
But the robbery theory seems less likely when detectives note that nothing of value seems to be missing from the home.
Sometimes you interrupt a robbery and, after the assault, the assailant, flees the scene without, making good the actual robbery. But there wasn't like a stereo system and a DVD and computers that were all like wrapped up in bags and ready to go by the front door by any stretch.
He also had his bag, which was on the floor. That had his wallet inside, which had his identification and about $365 of cash inside.
There's also no evidence of forced entry and hardly any signs of a struggle, except one item near the front door that catches detectives' attention.
The alarm panel is just inside the front door, and the cover for the alarm panel, there's a little plastic cover that closes shut. It's ripped off the alarm pad.
We need to find out how this alarm panel works.
Detectives reach out to the alarm company to see what may have been picked up through their monitoring. They're told it could take a while to get the report, but they are able to gather one new piece of information.
The alarm company told us that there were two key holders, one of them being Alan Lantang, and the other one being his husband, Demitry.
We were obviously interested in speaking to Demitry right away, but everyone, was under the impression that Demitry, his husband, was somewhere in Europe.
Detectives try to find a way to reach Demitry to let him know about Alan's passing, but they have a hard time making contact with him abroad. In the meantime, Alan's autopsy results come in, and they confirm his death had been the result of a prolonged and brutal assault.
Alan had multiple injuries to his head that, from the autopsy, appeared to be from what they call an elongated instrument, which can be an instrument that has some type of ridges on it.
It looked like he was actually bludgeoned to death with a crowbar or a bat.
It's really upsetting that he didn't even die right away. He knew that someone was attacking him, and he knew that someone was murdering him. That's the thing that really upset me.
Still, the autopsy does yield one promising new piece of evidence.
He managed to get some DNA from his attacker underneath the fingernails of his right hand, either by trying to defend himself or by swinging his arm through the air.
Alan's fingernail clippings are sent off for further forensic testing. But when the results come in, they only bring more questions.
We uncovered a male profile underneath Alan's fingernails that came back unknown. It didn't match to anyone known offender in the DNA database.
Detectives know they'll need to find a suspect before they're able to make a match. But then, the report from Alan's alarm system comes in.
Lo and behold, it turns out that the alarm recorded about, I think the number was 150 transactions. A transaction means every time that front door, even when the alarm is deactivated, is opened and closed, the sensors are registering an activity in the buffer.
In our investigation of the alarm panel, we learned that on the day that Alan was killed, which is March 2nd, 2011, the alarm was deactivated at 5:19.
That was significant to us because we knew that Alan had been witnessed by his coworkers leaving work at around 5 p.m. And then we knew from our own experience of walking the routes ourselves and from speaking to Alan's friends that it took about 35 minutes for Alan to walk home. We hypothesized that someone had laid in wait coming in the home at 5:19, deactivated the alarm. Alan left work at around 5 p.m. from University of Toronto. He walks 35 minutes home and comes in the door, and the ADT buffer registers an entry at 5:35. He then activates the alarm by punching in the code, I believe. The assault then occurs. Alan's killed, and the killer leaves.
This means the suspect would have to know Alan's home alarm code. But when police speak with Alan's friend, Grazia Mazzi, she tells them that Alan was very cautious and that no one besides Alan or his husband, Demitry, had access to the house.
Grazia told police that he was very security conscious. He was not the type of person who would have ever given out a copy of a key to his house or would have given out the security code to his alarm system.
He didn't want to share this with anyone. He told me it's just because he had very valuable stuff in his house and they want to protect it.
As one of the only two people with access to the house alarm, is it possible that Alan's husband, Demitry, might have traveled back to Canada and was somehow involved in Alan's murder?
Alan had just said he was in Europe, but he could have been in Toronto for all I know.
Where is his husband? Where is Demitry?
Toronto police are investigating the brutal murder of Alan Lantane. As the only other person with access to the house alarm, police need to question Alan's husband, Demitry Papasaterio Lantane, as soon as possible.
It was really hard for them to get Demitry on the phone to give an interview or to come back to Toronto to give an interview after his husband Alan was murdered.
In the meantime, detectives try to learn as much as they can about the marriage from Alan's closest friends.
We learned that after being married for about 4 years, Demitry and Alan, they encountered some marital problems.
Demitry seemed to rub people the wrong way. I remember one time he was over and we had a barbecue. Apparently I had said something to him. I still today do not know what I said to him that pissed him off. When Alan and them moved to the house together, I was not allowed to go to the house.
Alan said that Demitry didn't want anyone in his house. And so I never met him.
When Demitry eventually moved to Europe for school, Alan's friends admit they were relieved. But for Alan, the distance only seemed to add to his stress.
In addition to covering all the costs on their house on Ossington Avenue, Alan was also sending significant sums of money over to Europe to cover the lifestyle that Demitry was leading.
I confronted him about that. I say, why you continue to send money to Demitry? And he said, well, because we are married and I feel that it's my obligation.
As more and more questions about Alan's marriage arise, detectives finally hear back from Demitry.
A few days after the homicide occurs, Demitry phones the office and ends up getting one of the investigators online.
It turns out that the reason police hadn't been able to make contact with Demitry in Switzerland is because he had left his PhD program at the University of Lucerne and moved to Greece.
We learned that Demitry was in Athens, Greece, with his father.
When detectives inform Demitry of his husband's murder, his reaction catches them off guard.
It's a very strange conversation, letting them know, like, your husband's been murdered, we're investigating it. It turns very confrontational very quickly, to the point where Demitry says something along the lines, and I'm paraphrasing here, I'm a lawyer, I know my rights. That certainly raised some alarm bells with us as the investigators, that kind of bizarre reaction to the first interaction that the investigators are having with the grieving spouse.
The police are just saying, why are you still over there? Why don't you come back? Because at the end of the day, you guys have all this interconnection here.
That's when Demitry explains that he and Alan had settled into their lives apart.
The picture that Demitry painted for police during this phone interview was that they had an open marriage.
While Demitry denies he's been involved in any affair himself, the young lawyer claims he encouraged Alan to date other people while he was abroad. Soon, Demitry says, Alan found new companionship with several men he met online.
He wanted to speak, he wanted to clear his name, so to speak, to say that, open marriage and Mr. Lentine liked other partners, and so obviously it wasn't me.
Without evidence to suggest that Demitry was in Toronto at the time of Alan's murder, detectives agree it's worth looking into Alan's dating history.
We looked at Alan's cell phone and, again, interviewing his friends and family. We learned that Alan would date other individuals online.
Detectives begin tracking down each one of these individuals to speak with them directly. But after hours of interviews, police are unable to point to any new suspects in Alan's murder.
From all accounts, he was a positive person, well-liked by everyone, and didn't have any issues with anyone that he was dating, according to his friends and the people that we spoke with.
While the investigation into his murder appears to have hit a brick wall, Alan Lentine is laid to rest later that week.
Alan's family was hosting the funeral service. He had a lot of really close friends.
But there's one person noticeably missing from the funeral ceremony.
Demitry didn't come back to the funeral. We don't understand why.
If it had been an issue that Demitry couldn't have afforded to come home, there would have been a way to work that out. But he told us he can adequately grieve from afar, and, the funeral would just be too upsetting for him.
So far, police don't have any evidence connecting anyone to Alan's murder. That changes when police are alerted to a suspicious inquiry into Alan's retirement accounts.
3 weeks after the murder, a man who identified himself as Michael Jones showed up at the University of Toronto.
There was a life insurance policy that Alan has, being an employee at the University of Toronto. Michael Jones holds himself out to be an employee of a law firm and has shown up at the University of Toronto with the actual form claiming some of the death benefits.
In the part where you're supposed to write the cause of death, it was blank. So the individual asked Michael to fill that in. And Michael wrote bludgeoning.
This raised some red flags for us because we hadn't released the cause of death. So the only people that would know that is the killer and the police.
Police are eager to find out more about this mysterious Michael Jones. But before police can track him down, another tip comes in. It turns out that there had also been an unusual inquiry into Alan's retirement benefits at the restaurant company he previously worked for.
An employee received a voicemail from a Michael Visage, who claims to be working for a law firm and is inquiring about any death benefits that might be held in Alan's name.
Detectives learn that Michael Ivezich is the name of a Toronto area con artist who's had several run-ins with police.
We did some investigation in terms of who this person was, and I came to learn he had some negative contact with the police in terms of frauds.
With two men named Michael showing up at different locations in the same week to collect Alan's death benefits, Detectives theorize that Michael Jones and Michael Ivezich might be the same man.
We go back and show photo lineups to the staff at University of Toronto. They picked out Mr. Ivezich, so that's significant to us. Michael Jones was the alias that Michael Ivezich used at that interaction.
Police also learned that while making his inquiries into Alan's life insurance, Michael Ivezich had claimed to be working on behalf of Demitry Papasouteriou-Lantain.
We come to learn that Michael Ivezich has shown up at the University of Toronto with the actual form notarized and signed by Demitry, who we know is in Greece, and it's notarized with the Greek stamp.
Were Michael Ivezich and Demitry Papasouteriou-Lantain working together? Was it possible Michael Ivezich had forged Demitry's signature? And what, if anything, did Michael Ivezich have to do with Alan Lantain's murder?
We put a surveillance team on him with the hopes we would observe him smoking or drinking and collect that coffee cup or that cigarette butt, examine it for DNA, and submit it to the forensic lab to see if it's a match to our crime scene.
But days into their surveillance on Michael Ivezich, police receive an alarming update.
The surveillance team called me and said, listen, do you know anything about this guy? We're seeing him every day. He was out and about. And then we didn't see him all day yesterday. This guy's just vanished.
Coming up, police scramble to track down Michael Ivezich before he can disappear for good.
Canada doesn't really track outbound travel from our country, so there's no easy fix.
And a new witness exposes evidence of a deadly conspiracy.
She would physically track him when he would go from place to place. One of the places that she followed him to was to Alan and Demitry's house.
Toronto police have been tailing a local con man they believe may be connected to the murder of Alan Lantain. But days into their surveillance, Michael Ivezich has suddenly skipped town.
This guy's just vanished. We were very interested in Mr. Ivezich at that point. Canada doesn't really track outbound travel from our country, so there's no easy fix. So we immediately began to look into the background of Mr. Ivezich.
Michael Ivezich was born in the former Yugoslavia and at some point came to Canada. He was 51 years old.
He was married with 3 kids.
Detectives know Michael has a history of alleged fraud, though he's never officially been charged. But as they dive deeper into his business practices, they find that it's far from an isolated event.
He was an unsuccessful entrepreneur who had many failed businesses. He would make false promises to individuals, and these individuals would pay him a certain amount of money to invest in whatever the business was that Michael was trying to do. And ultimately, he couldn't deliver on the promises that he made.
As suspicions grow around Michael Ivezich, detectives know it's imperative that they track him down right away.
We reached out to our partners at Department of Homeland Security, and we learned that Michael Ivezich had landed in Boston and declared to the U.S. Customs that he was on his way to Athens, Greece.
Greece is also where Alan Lantain's estranged husband, Demitry Papasouteriou-Lantain, is currently living.
We were very interested in Mr. Ivezich at that point. Knowing that Demitry was in Greece, in Athens specifically, we hypothesized that at the very least, there was some kind of connection between Michael and Alan's husband, Demitry.
But what was that relationship? Hoping to find out, detectives meet with Michael's wife.
One of the things we learned is that his wife found out that Michael was having a sexual relationship with Demitry. One of the things she did is she would keep a journal in relation to everything that she was finding out about Michael.
She would track his online chat conversations, And she would physically track him when he would go from place to place. One of the places that she followed Michael to was to Alan and Demitry's house.
She also mentioned to us that he disappeared for long periods of time where no one was able to get a hold of him. Michael had visited Switzerland, Greece many times, on several occasions, back and forth.
But she said he was in the Toronto area at the time of Alan's murder.
The new evidence adds fuel to the theory that perhaps Michael and Demitry had conspired together to kill Alan. But as illuminating as Michael's wife's interview is to the investigation, detectives know it's not admissible in court.
Because of the spousal privilege, we weren't able to compel her as a witness.
Hoping to find more evidence to support Michael's wife's claims, detectives obtained search warrants for Alan and Demitry's phone and email correspondences.
We found that there was an email where Alan is expressing his frustrations to Demitry that Michael, or a person by the name of Michael, has a key to the house, and Alan is very upset about that. So that was significant to us.
This was an indicator for police that A, Michael and Demitry were in a relationship, and also that Michael had access to the house.
The emails leave little doubt that Michael had the opportunity to murder Alan Lantane. But what about a motive?
One email exchange that police uncovered between Michael and Demitry, Michael is telling Demitry that he loves him, that he thinks about him day and night, and that he was willing to leave his family to be with him.
Demitry and Michael were making plans to build a house in Greece. So Demitry's only income that we could establish was that he sent money by Alan.
We know from friends of Alan's that in the weeks, even months leading up to his murder, he was frustrated. He didn't want to be covering all these bills. He was sick of sending so much money over to his husband, Demitry.
He said, I told him that enough is enough. He could do whatever he wants. He could come back or stay there, but I will not send any money to him anymore. And I was kind of, shocked and happy about that, because I said, oh, finally he's starting, to realize that maybe there's something else that can be done. I remember that discussion because it's happened just a few days before he was killed.
Detectives already know that Michael Ivezich was trying to collect on Alan's retirement and insurance accounts from his jobs. But that's not all the couple stood to benefit from in Alan's death.
In addition, Lantang had a $2 million life insurance policy that he had taken out at some point before the murder happened that named Demitry as the sole beneficiary.
They had 2 million reasons to kill Alan. And with that amount of money, I guess they felt that life would be good.
But detectives have yet to link either man to the DNA collected from the crime scene. With Michael and Demitry both presumably still abroad, police turn to the next best thing.
Remember now that Michael was a father of 3, so police decided that they would get a sample from one of his teenage sons.
So again, we asked the surveillance team, can you get back out there and get us another sample?
After his son had been eating at a restaurant one day, police were able to seize a chopstick that his son had used. They got conclusive evidence at that point that the DNA that had been found on that chopstick that they seized belonged to the biological son of whoever they believed to have killed Alan Lantang, and that, of course, was Michael Ivezich.
And so at that stage, we had reasonable grounds to arrest Michael Ivezich for the first-degree murder of Alan Lantang. And because we had grounds to arrest Michael, we had the circumstantial grounds to also arrest Demitry.
But with Michael and Demitry still living outside of Canada, Toronto police will need some assistance.
So we're in communication with Interpol, who can, ultimately flag individuals that are traveling, from one place to another throughout Europe. They put what they call a red flag notice. So anytime he would attempt to get on a plane, fly from one place to another, Switzerland to Greece, he would be flagged and we would be ultimately notified.
We issued a warrant and the Interpol red notice for the arrest of Michael Ivezic in Greece. And then we waited till January of 2013 with very little interaction from the Greek authorities. And we're blowing up Interpol's phone and email, trying to find out what's going on with the investigation. Eventually, Michael is arrested.
But things prove more complicated in the arrest of Demitry Papasateriou-Lantane.
Demitry is a Greek citizen, and Canada has no extradition agreement with Greece.
Detectives can only hope that Demitry will eventually find a reason to travel outside of Greece, at which point they would be able to make the arrest. Then, 9 months later, a surprising call comes in.
It's Halloween. I'm out with my kids. They're trick-or-treating, and this Interpol notice has popped up. Demitry has landed at Pearson International Airport and is clearing customs. So I know he's back in the country, so we scramble a surveillance team.
We knew it was a matter of time that the police would find him.
9 months after Michael Ivezic was arrested for the murder of Alan Lantane, his lover and presumed accomplice, Demitry Papasateriou-Lantane, has landed back on Canadian soil.
We come to learn that Demitry had taken legal action against the insurance companies that hold Alan's death benefits.
Both of these insurance providers wouldn't end up paying the death benefit.
What the insurance company wanted was for him to come back and do a deposition hearing. Ultimately, Demitry, being the confident, cocky lawyer that he was, truly believed he was going to actually be successful in obtaining this claim. So he took that chance, come back.
But what Demitry didn't count on was that Toronto police would be monitoring his every move.
We scramble a surveillance team onto Demitry, and eventually we survey him to the law firm where the deposition occurs. Demitry gives evidence in his legal claim under oath, and then we have him arrested.
On November 27, 2017, 7.5 years after the death of Alan Lantane, Demitry Papasateriou-Lantane and Michael Ivezic faced trial together in a Toronto courtroom.
The Crown's theory was that Demitry was no longer going to be cared for, wined and dined by Alan, and knew about the $2 million life insurance policy and decided that he would use his lover, Michael, to commit the murder.
The defense for Demitry was very strategic because he was really throwing the co-accused under the bus. He didn't do it, this guy did it.
You had Michael's DNA underneath the fingernails, and there was evidence that Michael had a key at some point.
Prosecutors introduce emails that they claim reveal the depths of Demitry and Michael's relationship.
We don't know exactly how Demitry and Michael got together, but according to police, their relationship appears to have begun in about 2008 or 2009, and it by no means appeared to be a fling.
This was an intimate relationship. Something that's developed over years of reviewing emails. It was a romantic relationship. Michael referred to Demitry as baby boy.
They fell in love and they had all these plans to move in together at the expense of Alan Lantane.
The day of the murder on March 2nd, 2011, Demitry sent Alan an email asking if they could talk that night. He told Alan, "Don't dilly-dally on your way home from work." It was clear he wanted him to be there at his usual time. But really, of course, it was the Crown's theory that Demitry was just luring Alan to his death.
On the basis of that email, that probably gave the Crown their theory that Demitry was the kingpin, or he was the one that was behind it.
The trial goes on for nearly 7 months. Finally, on June 3, 2018, the jury is able to reach a verdict.
They find both Michael Ivizic and Demitry Papasteriou guilty of first-degree murder. In Canada, first-degree murder, there's a mandatory sentence. It is life in prison, and you're not entitled to your first parole hearing until you serve 25 years. So that means that you are a ward of the Canadian state for the rest of your natural-born life.
When the jury verdict came down, we were extremely happy with the verdict.
But the relief for Alan's friends and family is short-lived. Just 3 months later, in September of 2018, Demitry Papasteriou-Lantain appeals the verdict on the basis that the case against him was only circumstantial. While his appeal is pending, Demitry also convinces the Ontario Court of Appeal to release him from prison on bail.
We were just all taken aback that justice would let someone that's convicted of first-degree murder sentenced to life in prison. I don't care whether you're a flight risk or not. That was one of the reasons why he let him out on bail.
He's basically shackled and under complete house arrest with his ankle bracelet, with the IT technology. If he steps a foot outside the door, alarm will go off and the police will come and arrest him for a breach of his bail. Then he'll go in jail.
Until the case is settled by the Court of Appeal, Alan's loved ones can only wait.
It remains to be seen yet whether or not, the case is going to be settled. But time will tell. It has been a couple of years already, but the appeal could take up to 6 years or maybe even longer.
This lovely, selfless, intelligent man, as he was described by so many people to me, was stolen away from so many people who loved him, who through no fault of his own was murdered because somebody wanted to collect $2 million with life insurance, and that somebody never even ended up banking that money. So what was it for? Nothing. It was for nothing.
On the morning of July 29th, 1986, investigators gathered inside police headquarters at Berliner Tor in Hamburg, West Germany, believing they were about to witness the breakthrough that had eluded them for years. The atmosphere inside the building was serious but optimistic. Behind closed doors sat a man whose name had become synonymous with fear in the criminal underworld. Of Hamburg, a man suspected of carrying out a long series of contract killings. A man who, according to investigators, possessed information capable of exposing an entire network of organized crime operating within the notorious district of St. Pauli. His name was Werner Pinsner. For months, authorities had worked tirelessly to unravel a chain of murders that stretched across Hamburg's underworld. The victims came from a world that existed largely in shadows, a world of prostitution, protection rackets, gambling operations, and criminal rivalries. Many of those killed had enemies. Many lived dangerous lives. Yet the similarities between the murders had become impossible to ignore. Investigators believed they were dealing not with isolated acts of violence, but with a systematic campaign of execution. And now, the man at the center of that campaign had promised to talk. The significance of that promise cannot be overstated. For prosecutors and detectives, Pinsner represented more than a murder suspect. He represented a doorway into a hidden criminal ecosystem. Every confession he provided had the potential to reveal another name. Every name had the potential to reveal another conspiracy. Every conspiracy could expose powerful figures who had remained beyond the reach of law enforcement. For years, the authorities believed they were finally gaining the upper hand. Pinsner had already been arrested months earlier. Investigators had recovered the weapon they believed linked multiple murders together. Witnesses had come forward. Evidence had accumulated. The pressure around him was immense. Yet, during questioning, he displayed an unexpected willingness to cooperate. Again and again, he hinted that he was prepared to identify the people who had allegedly hired him. For law enforcement, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. The expectation was that the upcoming interrogation would mark a turning point. The murders that had terrified Hamburg's criminal circles might finally be explained. The hierarchy behind the violence might finally be revealed. The secrets of St. Pauli's underworld might finally be dragged into the light. Nobody in that room could have anticipated how differently the day would unfold. At first glance, the setting seemed secure. This was not a secluded warehouse or a dangerous street corner. It was police headquarters, the very place designed to uphold the law and protect public safety. The people present were not unsuspecting civilians. They were investigators, legal professionals, and officials entrusted with uncovering the truth. Yet beneath the surface, a fatal assumption had already taken hold. The assumption was that Werner Pinsner was under control. History would prove otherwise. As the interrogation began, those present focused on the information they hoped to obtain. Names, connections, motives, financial arrangements, evidence. The questions were numerous, and the stakes were enormous. Every answer carried the possibility of dismantling part of Hamburg's organized criminal network. But instead of answers, there would be gunfire. At some point during the meeting, Pinsner produced a hidden revolver. The sudden appearance of the weapon transformed the room instantly. Moments earlier, investigators had believed they were conducting an interview. Now, they were confronting a deadly crisis. According to accounts of the event, Pinsner declared, "This is a hostage situation." The words were brief. What followed was even faster. He opened fire. The first target was prosecutor Wolfgang Bistry. Bistry had come to the meeting as a representative of the justice system. His role was not merely procedural. He embodied the state's effort to hold violent offenders accountable and to expose the criminal. Structures that had fueled years of bloodshed. He was there because authorities believed the investigation was nearing a breakthrough. Instead, he became one of its final victims. The shot struck him before anyone had time to react. Chaos erupted immediately. The carefully controlled environment of the interrogation room disappeared in an instant. Shock replaced routine. Fear replaced confidence. The people inside the room were suddenly confronted with a reality that should have been impossible. A heavily suspected contract killer was armed inside police headquarters. 2 investigators fled to raise the alarm. The situation was unraveling faster than anyone could comprehend. Yet the violence was not over. In the confusion that followed, Pinsner turned his weapon toward his wife, Jutta Pinsner. She had played a significant role in the events leading up to that day. Her presence inside the building would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Questions about how the weapon entered police headquarters would dominate public discussion for years. But in that moment, none of those questions had answers. Only seconds remained. Pinsner shot Jutta. Then he turned the weapon on himself. The entire sequence of events reportedly unfolded in mere moments. When the immediate danger had passed and authorities entered the room, 3 people were dead. Prosecutor Wolfgang Bistry, Jutta Pinsner, Valna Pinsna. One surviving witness, a typist present during the interrogation, escaped with her life, but reportedly suffered severe psychological trauma that would remain with her long afterward. For investigators, the consequences were devastating. The man who had promised to reveal the truth was dead. The person capable of identifying those who had allegedly ordered multiple murders was gone forever. The possibility of exposing the full structure behind the killings vanished with him. In a matter of seconds, years of investigative effort had been transformed into uncertainty. The tragedy quickly expanded beyond the boundaries of a criminal case. Questions emerged across Hamburg and throughout West Germany. How had a firearm entered one of the most secure government buildings in the city? Why had a dangerous murder suspect been placed in circumstances that made such an event possible? Who, if anyone, bore responsibility for the catastrophic failures that had allowed it to happen? And perhaps most troubling of all, what information died with Werner Pinsner? Because the deeper authorities looked into the case, the more unsettling the picture became. The murders linked to Pinsner were already notorious. They pointed toward a violent struggle for power inside St. Pauli, Hamburg's infamous red light district. They suggested connections between organized crime figures, pimps, brothel operators, and contract violence. They hinted at relationships hidden beneath the visible surface of the city. Yet, after the shooting at police headquarters, the investigation was no longer simply about murder. It became a story about institutional failure. A story about trust placed in the wrong person. A story about a system that believed it was controlling a dangerous criminal, only to discover that the criminal still possessed the ability to dictate the ending. Decades later, the name Werner Pinsner continues to occupy a unique place in German criminal history, not only because of the murders attributed to him, not only because of his reputation as a contract killer, but because his final act occurred in a location where violence should have been impossible. Many notorious crimes begin in darkness. This one ended beneath the bright lights of a police headquarters, and with the sound of those gunshots. One of the most shocking chapters in the history of West German law enforcement began. To understand how the Werner Pinsner case unfolded, it is necessary to leave the interrogation room at Berliner Tor and travel back several years into a part of Hamburg that occupied a unique place in both German culture and German criminal history. Long before the gunshots inside police headquarters shocked the nation, another conflict had already been raging in the streets of St. Pauli. It was a quieter war, fought not by armies, but by criminal organizations, brothel operators, pimps, drug dealers, and those who profited from the district's vast underground economy. The victims whose lives became entangled in the Pinsner investigation did not emerge from a single incident. They came from a larger environment shaped by fear, competition, and violence. Their stories cannot be separated from the world in which they lived. During the early 1980s, Hamburg was one of West Germany's most important cities. As a major port and economic center, it attracted business, tourism, and opportunity. Yet alongside its respectable public image existed another reality. In the district of St. Pauli, particularly around the famous Reeperbahn area, a parallel economy flourished. The neighborhood was internationally known for its nightlife. Bright signs illuminated crowded streets. Bars, clubs, and entertainment venues attracted visitors from across Germany and beyond. For many outsiders, St. Pauli represented excitement and freedom. For those operating behind the scenes, however, it represented money, large amounts of money. Prostitution formed a major part of that economy. Alongside it existed protection rackets, illegal gambling operations, and drug trafficking networks. The criminal underworld had become deeply embedded within the district's daily life. Influence was measured not only through wealth, but through the ability to control territory, businesses, and people. For years, various criminal groups had found ways to coexist, often through informal arrangements and understandings. Violence existed, but there were limits. Then circumstances began to change. The arrival of the AIDS crisis during the early 1980s created new pressures throughout the sex industry. Public fear affected business. Customer numbers declined. Revenue decreased. For criminal enterprises that depended on a steady flow of money, the consequences were significant. Suddenly, Competition intensified. Businesses that had previously survived comfortably now faced uncertainty. Criminal groups that had tolerated one another's presence began viewing each other as obstacles. The struggle for control became more aggressive. Rivalries deepened. Distrust spread. Territory became increasingly valuable. In this environment, violence evolved from a threat into a business strategy. Eliminating competitors offered a direct route to greater influence and greater profit. Disputes that might once have been settled through intimidation or negotiation increasingly ended. With gunfire, murders began appearing with alarming frequency. Each killing sent a message. Each victim represented more than an individual loss of life. They represented shifts in power. They represented warnings. They represented the growing instability of an underworld descending into open conflict. It was within this atmosphere that Werner Pinsner would eventually emerge as a central figure. But before examining his role, it is important to recognize the people whose lives were lost during the violence that investigators later connected to him. Unlike many true crime cases, the victims here cannot be reduced to a single name or a single event. The murder investigation that eventually focused on Pinsner involved multiple deaths occurring over a period of time. According to investigative records, many of the victims came from Hamburg's criminal underworld. Some were rival brothel operators. Others were individuals involved in protection rackets. Still others occupied influential positions within the criminal hierarchy of St. Pauli. Their lives often existed beyond public attention. Some may have been feared. Some may have been controversial. Some may have been involved in illegal activity themselves. Yet none of that changes a fundamental truth. They were human beings. Regardless of their backgrounds, their deaths became part of a cycle of violence that consumed the district. The circumstances surrounding these killings shared certain similarities. Victims were often targeted deliberately. The attacks appeared planned rather than spontaneous. Several were reportedly shot at close range. The pattern suggested a killer who approached murder not as an emotional outburst, but as a task to be completed. Investigators would later conclude that many of these deaths were connected by more than coincidence. They appeared linked by method, by motive, and ultimately by evidence. Yet for a long time, the victims remained fragments of separate investigations. Each death generated questions. Each death produced leads. Each death left families, acquaintances, and communities searching for explanations. As the number of killings increased, fear spread throughout St. Pauli. People who worked in the district understood that something was changing. Rumors circulated. Conversations became quieter. Trust became harder to find. Individuals who might possess information had reasons to remain silent. In environments dominated by organized crime, speaking openly can carry enormous risks. The possibility of retaliation is often enough to discourage cooperation. Consequently, many answers remained hidden. Investigators were not simply confronting murders. They were confronting a culture of fear. Yet among all the victims connected to the broader story, one name occupies a particularly significant place. Wolfgang Bistry. Unlike the earlier victims, Bistry was not a participant in Hamburg's underworld. He was a prosecutor. His role was to represent the justice system itself. By the summer of 1986, he had become involved in efforts to uncover the truth surrounding the murders attributed to Werner Pinsner and the criminal networks operating within St. Pauli. His presence at the final interrogation reflected the importance authorities attached to the investigation. Prosecutors do not attend such meetings casually. Bistry was there because officials believed they were approaching a major breakthrough. They believed valuable information was about to be revealed. They believed the investigation might finally expose the individuals who had benefited from years of violence. Instead, Bistry became one of the case's most tragic victims. His death transformed the investigation from a major criminal case into a national scandal. The killing of a prosecutor inside police headquarters carried enormous symbolic significance. It represented an attack not only on an individual, but on the institutions responsible for maintaining justice. Yet another victim deserves consideration as well: Jutta Pinsner. Her role in the final events remains inseparable from the story. She was Werner Pinsner's wife and became deeply connected to the circumstances surrounding the last day of his life. Later investigations concluded that she played a role in bringing the weapon that entered police headquarters. Her presence in the interrogation room on July 29, 1986, would ultimately place her at the center of one of Germany's most shocking criminal incidents. During the chaos that unfolded, she too lost her life. Her death added another layer of tragedy to an already devastating event. It also complicated public understanding of the case, forcing observers to grapple with difficult questions about loyalty, influence, and personal responsibility. Beyond the individuals who died, there were other victims whose suffering is often less visible. Witnesses who lived through the violence carried psychological scars. Investigators spent years pursuing answers that would never fully emerge. The typist who survived the shooting inside police headquarters reportedly endured severe trauma. Even members of the public experienced a loss of confidence as details of the security failures became known. The impact of violent crime extends far beyond those who appear in official casualty counts. It ripples outward through families, workplaces, institutions, and entire communities. What makes the Werner Pinsner case particularly compelling is that it sits at the intersection of two different worlds. On one side stands the criminal underworld of St. Pauli, a place shaped by money, fear, and competition. On the other side stands the justice system, represented by investigators, prosecutors, and police officers attempting to impose order. For years, those worlds collided repeatedly through acts of violence. Eventually, they collided inside a police building itself. The result was a tragedy that shocked Germany and left questions that remain unanswered decades later. As the conflict within St. Pauli intensified, one figure was gradually acquiring a reputation unlike any other. He was not a gang leader. He was not a powerful businessman. He was not a public figure. Yet his name began appearing wherever violence occurred. Investigators would eventually come to believe that he had become something far more dangerous. A man willing to kill for hire. A man who transformed criminal disputes into death sentences. A man whose actions would alter the course of German criminal history. His name was Werner Pinsner, and before long, the investigation would begin to focus directly on him. Long before his name became associated with one of the most shocking security failures in German criminal history, Werner Pinsner was already a familiar figure to law enforcement. The path that eventually led him into the center of Hamburg's underworld did not begin with the murders that made him infamous. It began years earlier, through a pattern of criminal behavior that steadily escalated in seriousness. Born in Hamburg in 1947, Pinsner grew up in the same city that would later become the stage for his crimes. The available records paint a picture of a man who encountered the criminal justice system at an early age. Theft and acts of violence appeared among his offenses, placing him on a trajectory that increasingly distanced him from ordinary life. While countless individuals with troubled pasts eventually changed direction, Pinsner's story followed a darker course. By the mid-1970s, his criminal activities had intensified dramatically. In 1975, he participated in an armed robbery that ended in tragedy. During the course of the crime, a person was killed. The details available in the case material are limited, but the outcome was clear. A life had been lost, and Pinsner was convicted. He received a prison sentence and entered the correctional system. For many offenders, imprisonment serves as a moment of reflection or rehabilitation. In other cases, however, prison becomes a place where criminal connections deepen. According to the information later uncovered by investigators, Pinsner's time behind bars exposed him to individuals connected to the criminal world of St. Pauli. Rather than separating him from organized crime, incarceration appears to have brought him closer to it. Within prison, he established relationships that would eventually prove significant. He also gained access to narcotics and became increasingly immersed in criminal networks. These connections mattered because St. Pauli during the early 1980s was not merely a neighborhood. It was a marketplace of influence. Money flowed through legal and illegal enterprises alike. Individuals capable of enforcing decisions through intimidation or violence held considerable value. The criminal groups operating there did not simply require businessmen or organizers. They also required individuals willing to perform the most dangerous tasks. Somewhere during this period, Werner Pinsner began evolving into exactly that kind of person. One detail from the case stands out as particularly troubling. During his time within Hamburg's prison system, Pinsner somehow gained access to a firearm. Specifically, he possessed an Arminius .38 caliber revolver. The existence of this weapon would later become enormously important, not only because it represented a security failure, but because investigators would eventually connect it to multiple killings. The revolver would become one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the entire investigation. At the time, however, nobody fully understood the role it would play. Compounding the situation was the fact that Pinsner benefited from a semi-open prison system. Under this arrangement, certain inmates could receive limited freedoms and movement outside prison facilities under specific conditions. The system was designed with rehabilitation in mind. Yet in Pinsner's case, those freedoms allegedly created opportunities that would later draw intense criticism. As he gained greater mobility, he was no longer isolated from the criminal contacts he had cultivated. Instead, he remained connected to the environment that valued violence as a tool of business. Investigators later concluded that this period marked a crucial transition. Pinsner was no longer merely a criminal offender. He was becoming something else entirely. A contract killer. In organized crime, contract killings serve a practical purpose. They allow those who order murders to distance themselves from the act itself. The individual issuing the command remains hidden while another person carries out the violence. Such arrangements create layers of protection and secrecy. They also create a demand for individuals willing to kill in exchange for money or favor. According to the information gathered during the investigation, Pinsner eventually filled that role. His reputation grew within criminal circles as someone capable of solving problems permanently. In a world where rivalries could cost fortunes and territorial disputes threatened income, there was no shortage of people willing to pay for such services. Among the most significant figures connected to Pinsner was a pimp known by the nickname Wiener Peter. According to later accounts, Wiener Peter became one of Pinsner's primary clients. The relationship between the two men reflected the larger conflict consuming St. Pauli. Competition within the prostitution industry had become increasingly fierce. Rival brothel operators fought for influence. Disputes over territory and control intensified. The stakes were measured not only in reputation, but in substantial financial gain. In that environment, eliminating competitors could dramatically alter the balance of power. Investigators later believed that Pinsner was repeatedly hired to carry out precisely that objective. The murders attributed to him were not random acts of violence. They appeared targeted and deliberate. One victim was reportedly a rival brothel operator who was shot and killed inside an apartment. Others included prominent figures involved in protection rackets and organized criminal activity. Within Hamburg, several victims were ambushed. Others were attacked at close range. What linked these crimes was not simply the identity of the victims, but the method used against them. The attacks suggested planning. The shooter approached with purpose. There was little indication of hesitation. This pattern gradually became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The killings appeared efficient. They lacked the chaotic characteristics often associated with crimes of passion. Instead, they carried the hallmarks of assignments being completed. The victims themselves occupied different positions within Hamburg's criminal underworld, but the message sent by their deaths was consistent. No one was beyond reach. As the body count increased, fear spread throughout St. Pauli. Individuals involved in the district's criminal economy understood the significance of what was happening. Every murder shifted the balance of power. Every shooting generated new rumors. Every unexplained death heightened anxiety. Conversations increasingly revolved around questions that nobody could answer with certainty. Who was behind the killings? Which rival would be targeted next? Was a single individual responsible? Or was an entire organization conducting a campaign of violence? For law enforcement, the challenge was immense. Criminal environments often operate according to their own rules. Witnesses are reluctant to cooperate. Victims frequently possess complicated histories. Potential suspects have motives to remain silent. As a result, many murders linked to organized crime become difficult to solve. Yet despite these obstacles, investigators began noticing similarities. The shootings shared common characteristics. The victims occupied similar worlds. The methods appeared connected. Most importantly, evidence collected from multiple crime scenes suggested that the same weapon may have been involved. The Arminius .38 revolver was gradually emerging as a crucial piece of the puzzle. Firearms leave unique marks on bullets and cartridge cases. Through ballistic examination, investigators can sometimes determine whether separate crimes involve the same weapon. In the Pinsner investigation, those forensic connections would eventually become impossible to ignore. Although the public did not yet know it, detectives were slowly assembling a picture of a single individual standing at the center of numerous violent incidents. Meanwhile, Pinsner's reputation within the underworld continued to grow. The very qualities that made him valuable to criminal employers also made him dangerous. A contract killer occupies a unique position within organized crime. He may not control territory. He may not manage businesses. He may not command large groups of followers. Yet his actions can influence the fate of powerful people. Through violence, he becomes an instrument through which others pursue their ambitions. This role often creates an illusion of power while simultaneously making the killer expendable. The more secrets he accumulates, the greater the risk he represents to those around him. By the mid-1980s, investigators increasingly believed that Werner Pinsner possessed a vast amount of knowledge regarding Hamburg's criminal landscape. If their suspicions were correct, he knew who ordered murders. He knew who benefited from them. He knew which rivalries had escalated into bloodshed. He may have understood relationships that remained invisible to authorities. Yet proving those suspicions required evidence. Detectives still needed witnesses. They still needed forensic confirmation. They still needed a way to connect the killings conclusively to the man they believed responsible. The challenge was substantial, but momentum was beginning to shift. Every investigation reaches a point where scattered fragments start forming a coherent picture. In the Pinsner case, that moment was approaching. The murders that had once seemed isolated were becoming linked. The weapon that had appeared in multiple crime scenes was attracting greater scrutiny. Individuals with knowledge of the underworld were beginning to emerge as potential sources of information. The circle around Pinsner was slowly tightening. He may have spent years operating in the shadows, but those shadows were becoming smaller. Investigators were closing in. The era in which contract killings could occur without consequence was beginning to face its greatest challenge. Soon, witnesses would come forward. A special task force would intensify its efforts. Evidence would accumulate, and for the first time, authorities would move decisively against the man they believed had turned murder into a profession. Werner Pinsner's rise within Hamburg's underworld was nearing its end. The investigation that would eventually expose him was about to begin. By the beginning of 1986, investigators in Hamburg were no longer looking at a collection of unrelated murders. What had once appeared to be separate acts of violence scattered throughout the criminal underworld of St. Pauli was gradually revealing a pattern. The challenge facing law enforcement was not a lack of victims. It was the opposite. There were too many connections, too many rumors, too many names circulating through the city's underworld. The difficulty lay in transforming suspicion into evidence. Organized crime investigations are rarely straightforward. Witnesses disappear. Informants change their stories. Fear often proves stronger than loyalty to the law. In the world surrounding St. Pauli, silence had become a survival strategy. People understood that speaking openly about violent crime could carry serious consequences. Many of those who possessed valuable information had every reason to keep it hidden. Yet despite these obstacles, investigators continued moving forward. One of the most important developments came from forensic analysis. While public attention often focuses on dramatic arrests and courtroom confrontations, many major investigations advance through far quieter means. In this case, the examination of ballistic evidence became increasingly significant. The victims connected to the murders had been killed under different circumstances and in different locations. But investigators noticed similarities in the shootings. Forensic specialists carefully examined projectiles and other evidence recovered from crime scenes. Firearms leave distinctive markings when they are fired. The internal characteristics of a gun barrel create microscopic patterns that can sometimes be matched to bullets recovered from victims or crime scenes. Such evidence can establish links between incidents that initially appear unrelated. In the Pinsner investigation, these forensic examinations pointed investigators toward a disturbing possibility. Multiple murders appeared connected to the same weapon. The implication was enormous. If one firearm had been used repeatedly, then investigators were not dealing with random violence. They were potentially dealing with a single killer or a coordinated operation. The evidence strengthened the growing belief that numerous deaths throughout Hamburg's underworld were part of a larger pattern. Among investigators, a name increasingly emerged as a possible explanation for that pattern: Werner Pinsner. Detectives had begun examining his background, his criminal history, and his associations within St. Pauli. The more they looked, the more concerning the picture became. Pinsner occupied a position that connected him to multiple criminal circles. His relationships within the underworld placed him near individuals who possessed motives, resources, and influence. More importantly, investigators suspected he had access to the very weapon they were attempting to trace. Yet suspicion alone was not enough. Law enforcement still needed witnesses willing to speak. Without testimony, many organized crime cases remained trapped in a cycle of rumors and assumptions. Investigators therefore focused significant effort on locating individuals who could provide direct information. Eventually, that effort produced results. 2 women working as prostitutes came forward with information that would become critical to the case. Their decision carried considerable risk. The environment surrounding St. Pauli was not one in which cooperation with authorities was welcomed. Individuals who challenged criminal networks often faced serious consequences. Nevertheless, their statements provided investigators with valuable leads. For detectives who had spent months assembling fragments of information, the testimony represented a breakthrough. The significance of witnesses in organized crime investigations cannot be overstated. Physical evidence may establish that a crime occurred, but witness testimony often helps explain who committed it and why. In this case, The information supplied by the two women helped investigators move from theory toward action. Their statements reinforced suspicions that had been building for months. The time for observation was ending. The time for arrest was approaching. Authorities responded by intensifying the investigation. A special task force was assembled to focus specifically on the murders and the criminal networks surrounding them. The creation of such a unit reflected the seriousness of the case. Investigators understood they were no longer pursuing a single homicide suspect. They were potentially confronting an entire structure of organized crime operating within Hamburg. The task force examined evidence, coordinated intelligence, and worked to establish a comprehensive picture of the relationships connecting various suspects. Every piece of information was evaluated. Every lead was pursued. The objective was not merely to identify a killer, but to expose the wider system that had enabled repeated acts of violence. Eventually, the investigation reached a decisive moment. On April 15, 1986, authorities moved against Werner Pinsner and his associates. After months of surveillance, analysis, and preparation, the arrest operation was carried out. For investigators, this represented a major achievement. The suspect who had occupied the center of their investigation was finally in custody. During searches connected to the operation, authorities recovered the firearm believed to have played a crucial role in the murders. The recovery of the weapon was a significant development. Forensic evidence had already suggested links between multiple crime scenes. Now investigators possessed the gun itself. The seizure strengthened the case considerably and appeared to validate months of investigative work. At this stage, many observers might have expected the story to move directly toward prosecution and trial. Instead, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Once in custody, Werner Pinsner began behaving in a manner that surprised investigators. Rather than maintaining complete silence, he appeared willing to cooperate. This development transformed the nature of the case. A suspect who refuses to speak can be prosecuted using available evidence. A suspect who offers information about broader criminal networks presents a different opportunity entirely. Investigators soon realized that Pinsner might possess knowledge extending far beyond the murders attributed to him. According to accounts from the investigation, he repeatedly suggested that he could identify the individuals who had ordered killings. Such information had the potential to expose powerful figures operating behind the scenes. The possibility was extraordinarily attractive to law enforcement. Organized crime investigations often struggle to reach those who give orders rather than those who carry them out. If Pinsner was prepared to reveal names, authorities might finally gain access to the higher levels of St. Pauli's criminal hierarchy. Prosecutors and investigators, therefore, continued questioning him. Each interview carried the promise of a major breakthrough. The expectation grew that Pinsner would eventually provide details capable of transforming the entire investigation. Detectives hoped to identify the people who benefited from the murders. Prosecutors hoped to build cases against influential criminal figures. The city itself seemed on the verge of receiving answers to questions that had lingered for years. As the interviews continued, anticipation increased. Authorities believed they were making progress. The investigation was no longer focused solely on past murders. It had expanded into an effort to dismantle organized crime networks. In many respects, Pinsner had become the most important witness in his own case. He occupied a unique position. As the suspected killer, he understood the mechanics of the murders. As an insider, he allegedly understood the criminal structures behind them. Few individuals possessed such a combination of knowledge. Yet this new strategy carried hidden risks. The more valuable Pinsner appeared as a source of information, the more attention shifted toward what he might reveal in the future rather than the danger he continued to represent in the present. Investigators were focused on obtaining names, connections, and confessions. They were looking ahead to the broader criminal network they hoped to expose. In hindsight, critics would argue that this focus contributed to a series of decisions that underestimated the threat posed by the man in custody. At the time, however, many officials viewed cooperation as the best path forward. Every conversation with Pinsner seemed to offer the possibility of uncovering something significant. As weeks passed, the expectation of a major revelation became deeply embedded within the investigation. Detectives believed they were approaching a critical moment. Prosecutors prepared for the possibility of new charges and new suspects. The prospect of dismantling elements of Hamburg's criminal underworld appeared increasingly realistic. Yet beneath this optimism, vulnerabilities were beginning to emerge. Security measures that might have seemed adequate under ordinary circumstances would later face intense scrutiny. Questions regarding access, supervision, and procedural safeguards were not yet dominating public discussion. Those debates would come later. For the moment, confidence remained high. Authorities believed they had control of the situation. They believed they understood the man sitting in custody. Most importantly, they believed he was preparing to tell the truth. Looking back, this period now appears as the calm before the storm. The investigation had gathered momentum. Evidence had been collected. Witnesses had spoken. The suspect had been arrested. The weapon had been recovered. From a law enforcement perspective, the case seemed to be moving steadily toward resolution. Few could imagine that the most devastating chapter was still ahead. By the summer of 1986, plans were underway for further questioning. Investigators expected that the next sessions would finally produce the information they had been seeking. The atmosphere surrounding the case was one of cautious anticipation. There was still work to do, but the path forward appeared clear. What nobody recognized was that the assumptions underpinning the entire process were about to collapse. Within a matter of months, the investigation would move from a story of progress to a story of catastrophe. The man authorities believed was preparing to expose Hamburg's criminal underworld was already preparing something very different. The final interrogation was approaching, and with it came a chain of events that would forever alter the history of the case. By late July 1986, the investigation into Werner Pinsner had reached what many officials believed would be its defining moment. Months of work had produced arrests, recovered evidence, witness testimony, and a growing belief that authorities were finally on the verge of uncovering the full extent of organized criminal activity within Hamburg's St. Pauli district. The atmosphere surrounding the case was no longer one of uncertainty. Investigators had moved beyond merely identifying a suspect. They now believed they possessed something even more valuable: access to information hidden deep inside the criminal underworld. At the center of that expectation stood Werner Pinsner himself. During his detention, he had repeatedly suggested that he was willing to reveal the names of individuals who had allegedly commissioned murders. To prosecutors and detectives, this possibility was enormously significant. Every criminal investigation seeks answers, but some cases offer the chance to expose entire networks rather than isolated offenders. Authorities increasingly viewed Pinsner as the key to unlocking those answers. They expected that further questioning would reveal who had benefited from the violence, who had paid for it, and how the criminal hierarchy of St. Pauli truly operated behind closed doors. As preparations were made for another round of questioning, few could have imagined that the investigation was approaching not a breakthrough, but a catastrophe. On July 29, 1986, Werner Pinsner was brought to police headquarters at Berliner Tor in Hamburg. The purpose of the meeting was straightforward. Investigators intended to question him further regarding the murders and the individuals allegedly connected to them. Present in the room were several people whose roles reflected the importance of the occasion. Among them was prosecutor Wolfgang Bisteri, a central representative of the justice system. His presence underscored how seriously authorities viewed the information they hoped to obtain. Also present were two police investigators responsible for pursuing the case. A typist attended to document the proceedings. Pinsner's wife, Jutta Pinsner, was there as well, along with his defense lawyer, Isolde Eschemisfeld. On the surface, the arrangement may have appeared unusual, but at the time, it was proceeding within a framework that officials apparently believed was secure. Yet unknown to many of those involved, a chain of decisions had already set the stage for disaster. Later investigations would conclude that a firearm had been smuggled into police headquarters. According to the findings that emerged afterward, defense lawyer Isolde Eschemisfeld had obtained a Smith & Wesson revolver. The weapon was then transferred to Jutta Pinsner. She subsequently brought the firearm into the police building without detection. The implications of this revelation would later shock the public. Police headquarters represented one of the last places where such a security breach should have been possible. The fact that a firearm entered the building at all would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. Yet on that morning, none of those failures had yet become visible. The participants entered the interrogation believing they were about to engage in a discussion. They expected questions and answers. They expected information. They expected cooperation. Instead, they were about to witness violence. As the interrogation began, Pinsner reportedly maintained the impression that he was willing to talk. This was precisely what investigators had hoped for. They believed they were approaching a critical moment in the investigation. Every previous conversation seemed to have pointed toward this opportunity. The expectation of a confession or revelation hung over the room. Authorities had reason to believe that names would finally be provided. Connections would finally be exposed. The secrets surrounding the murders might finally be brought into the open. Then everything changed. At some point during the proceedings, Werner Pinsner produced the hidden revolver. The appearance of the weapon instantly transformed the situation. One moment the room functioned as an interrogation space. The next, it became the scene of an armed crisis. According to accounts of the event, Pinsner announced, "This is a hostage situation." Those words marked the end of the investigation as authorities had imagined it. The declaration was immediately followed by violence. Pinsner opened fire. His first target was prosecutor Wolfgang Bistry. Bistry had arrived expecting to participate in an important legal proceeding. Instead, he became one of the victims. The shooting happened so suddenly that there was little opportunity for anyone present to respond. The prosecutor was struck and killed. The attack sent shockwaves through the room. The assumptions that had guided the investigation collapsed in an instant. Detectives who had spent months pursuing answers were suddenly fighting for survival. Faced with an armed suspect, the two investigators fled to raise the alarm. Their departure reflected the speed with which the situation had deteriorated. What had begun as a formal interrogation had become a deadly emergency inside police headquarters itself. Yet the violence was not over. During the chaos that followed, Pinsner turned toward his wife, Jutta. The reasons behind his action remain known only to him. What is documented is the outcome. He shot her. Within moments, she too was dead. The tragedy now encompassed not only the prosecutor, but also the woman whose role in bringing the weapon into the building would later become a focus of public attention. Then came the final act. After shooting his wife, Werner Pinsner turned the weapon on himself. He pulled the trigger. The suspected contract killer, whose testimony had become central to one of Hamburg's largest organized crime investigations, was dead. The entire sequence reportedly unfolded within seconds. The rapidity of the event contributed to the shock experienced by everyone involved. By the time authorities could fully respond, the damage had already been done. When tactical personnel and responding officers entered the room, they encountered a scene that few could have imagined possible inside a police headquarters. 3 people were dead, prosecutor Wolfgang Bisteri, Jutta Pinsner, and Werner Pinsner himself. The typist present during the interrogation survived the ordeal. Physically, she escaped the violence. Psychologically, however, the impact would reportedly remain with her for many years. Witnessing such an event at close range is an experience capable of leaving profound trauma. Her survival served as a reminder that the consequences of violent crime extend beyond those who lose their lives. In the immediate aftermath, confusion spread throughout the building and beyond. News of the shooting rapidly reached officials, journalists, and the public. The details seemed almost impossible to believe. A suspected contract killer had obtained a firearm inside police headquarters. A prosecutor had been murdered during an interrogation. The primary suspect in a major criminal investigation had killed himself before providing the information authorities sought. The case instantly transformed from a murder investigation into a national scandal. From a legal perspective, the consequences were immense. In ordinary circumstances, the next stage would have involved prosecution and trial. Evidence would have been presented. Witnesses would have testified. Prosecutors would have sought convictions. Defense attorneys would have challenged the allegations. The judicial process would have examined the facts in open court. None of that happened. Pinsner's death effectively ended the possibility of a conventional trial against him. The man accused of multiple murders could no longer be questioned. He could no longer testify. He could no longer provide additional names or information. The courtroom proceedings many had expected simply never occurred. This absence of a trial created a vacuum. Investigators possessed evidence. They possessed witness statements. They possessed the recovered firearm linked to multiple killings. Yet without the suspect alive to face prosecution, many questions remained unresolved. Some allegations could never be fully tested through judicial proceedings. Some theories could never be conclusively confirmed. The legal system lost the opportunity to publicly examine the entirety of what authorities believed had occurred. Just as significant was the loss of information. Throughout the investigation, officials had hoped that Pinsner would identify the individuals who had allegedly ordered murders. His death eliminated that possibility. Whatever knowledge he possessed regarding the structure of organized crime within St. Pauli died. With him, whether he would have fully cooperated remains unknown. Whether he truly intended to reveal everything remains uncertain. What is certain is that investigators never received the answers they were expecting on July 29, 1986. Instead of obtaining names, they were left with silence. The role of defense lawyer Isolde Ishemisfeld quickly became a subject of intense scrutiny. Investigators later concluded that she had purchased the Smith & Wesson revolver used during the shooting and transferred it through Jutta Pinsner. These findings intensified public outrage. The notion that a firearm had entered police headquarters through individuals directly connected to the suspect raised profound questions about security, professional responsibility, and procedural oversight. Public confidence was shaken. If such a breach could occur in one of Germany's most important criminal investigations, many wondered where else vulnerabilities might exist. In the days that followed, officials faced mounting pressure. The shooting was no longer viewed merely as an isolated act of violence. It had become evidence of a systemic failure. The investigation that authorities believed would expose organized crime had instead exposed weaknesses within their own institutions. The deaths inside police headquarters marked the end of Werner Pinsner's life. But they did not mark the end of the story. In many ways, they marked the beginning of an entirely new chapter, one defined by public outrage, political fallout, unanswered questions, and a lingering mystery that continues to surround the case decades later. The suspect was dead. The prosecutor was dead. The investigation had lost its most important source of information. What remained were questions. Questions that would echo throughout Germany long after the gunfire stopped. The gunfire inside Hamburg police headquarters lasted only moments. The consequences lasted far longer. In the immediate aftermath of July 29, 1986, investigators were forced to confront a reality that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. A suspected contract killer had entered a police interrogation armed with a concealed revolver. A prosecutor had been murdered in the course of his duties. The suspect's wife had been killed. The suspect himself was dead. And perhaps most damaging of all, the investigation that authorities believed would expose one of Hamburg's most significant criminal networks had effectively collapsed in front of them. Across Hamburg, disbelief quickly turned into anger. Across West Germany, headlines focused not only on Werner Pinsner's crimes, but on the circumstances surrounding his final act. The public did not merely want to know what had happened. They wanted to know how it had been allowed to happen. Those questions would dominate discussions for months and years afterward. In many criminal cases, the death of a suspect brings a sense of closure. Here, the opposite occurred. Pinsner's death created a vacuum. Rather than providing answers, it generated even more uncertainty. Investigators had spent months pursuing evidence that suggested Pinsner occupied a central role in a series of murders connected to Hamburg's underworld. They believed he possessed valuable information regarding the individuals who allegedly commissioned those killings. They hoped that continued cooperation would reveal names, relationships, and financial arrangements hidden behind the violence. Instead, the most important witness in the case was suddenly gone. Whatever knowledge Werner Pinsner possessed died with him. The consequences of that loss extended far beyond a single investigation. Every unsolved question surrounding the murders became more difficult to answer. Every potential lead became harder to verify. Every theory became more complicated to prove. Authorities were left attempting to reconstruct a hidden criminal network without the testimony of the individual who may have known it best. The public quickly focused on a series of troubling questions. The first concerned access. Why had a man suspected of involvement in multiple murders been allowed contact with family members under circumstances that ultimately enabled the tragedy? This question struck at the heart of institutional decision-making. Officials had viewed Pinsner not only as a suspect, but also as a potential source of information. In retrospect, many observers wondered whether that perspective had caused authorities to underestimate the risks involved. The second question proved even more alarming. How had a firearm entered police headquarters? Police buildings exist precisely to maintain security. Citizens expect them to be among the safest locations in society. Yet somehow, a revolver had been successfully smuggled into an interrogation involving one of the most important criminal suspects in Hamburg. To many members of the public, this failure seemed almost incomprehensible. The discovery that Jutta Pinsner had reportedly carried the weapon into the building after receiving it through defense lawyer Isolde Ischimisfeld intensified concerns. The event exposed vulnerabilities that few people had previously considered possible. If such a breach could occur during a major investigation, what did that reveal about broader security procedures? The third question touched upon a subject that often emerges whenever organized crime intersects with institutional failure: corruption. Some observers wondered whether individuals within positions of authority had maintained inappropriate relationships with elements of the St. Pauli underworld. The available information does not establish such involvement, but the very existence of the question reflected the level of public distrust generated by the scandal. Organized crime thrives in environments where oversight weakens and accountability disappears. Whenever criminal networks appear capable of operating for extended periods, speculation regarding official complicity inevitably follows. The fourth question focused on the prison system itself. How had Werner Pinsner previously managed to gain access to a firearm while benefiting from Hamburg's semi-open prison arrangements? The issue was especially troubling because the weapon linked to multiple murders had reportedly been possessed during a period when authorities should have been exercising supervision. Critics argued that the case exposed weaknesses in correctional oversight. Supporters of rehabilitation programs faced difficult questions regarding how such systems should balance trust with security. These debates extended far beyond the Pinsner case itself. They touched upon broader questions regarding criminal justice policy and public safety. As public scrutiny intensified, investigations were launched into the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Officials examined procedures, decisions, and security failures. The objective was not simply to understand what had happened, but to determine how similar events could be prevented in the future. The results proved politically damaging. The scandal generated significant pressure within Hamburg's legal and governmental institutions. Internal investigations led to severe criticism. Careers were affected. Public confidence was shaken. Several senior officials faced consequences ranging from intense public scrutiny to resignation and political fallout. The incident came to be viewed as one of the most serious security failures in post-war West German history. For many observers, the case represented more than a criminal investigation gone wrong. It represented a breakdown of systems that citizens trusted to function properly. While institutions struggled with accountability, individuals connected to the tragedy faced their own burdens. Among them was the typist who survived the shooting. Often, discussions of crime focused primarily on those who died. Yet survivors frequently carry invisible wounds. According to reports, the typist suffered severe psychological trauma after witnessing the violence inside the interrogation room. Such outcomes are common among individuals exposed to sudden acts of lethal violence. The memories remain long after physical danger has passed. In many respects, her experience serves as a reminder that criminal acts affect far more people than official casualty counts might suggest. Families, colleagues, witnesses, investigators, and entire communities can continue living with the consequences long after public attention fades. As the years passed, another aspect of the case began attracting increasing attention: the unanswered mysteries. Despite extensive investigation, significant uncertainties remained. One of the most enduring questions concerns the murders themselves. Did Werner Pinsner actually commit every killing he was suspected of carrying out? According to investigative records, he was linked to approximately 11 to 13 murders. Yet because the legal process was interrupted by his death, some questions surrounding specific cases remained unresolved. Another mystery concerns the individuals who allegedly hired him. Throughout the investigation, authorities believed Pinsner possessed information about those who commissioned murders within Hamburg's criminal underworld. The expectation that he would eventually reveal those names became one of the central motivations behind continued questioning. When he died, those names are never publicly disclosed. Whether he truly intended to identify them remains unknown. Whether he possessed evidence capable of implicating influential figures remains equally uncertain. The absence of definitive answers has fueled decades of speculation. A related question involves the possibility of additional crimes. Investigators and observers have periodically wondered whether Pinsner may have been connected to other unsolved murders beyond those formally associated with the case. Without his testimony, establishing such links became far more difficult. The passage of time only compounded those difficulties. Witnesses disappear, evidence deteriorates, memories fade. What might once have been knowable gradually becomes historical uncertainty. Perhaps the most intriguing mystery concerns the events inside police headquarters themselves. Was the shooting simply the final act of a desperate man facing the collapse of his criminal career? Or was it, as some have speculated, an effort to ensure that certain secrets remain buried forever? The available evidence does not provide a definitive answer. What is clear is that the shooting prevented authorities from obtaining the information they sought. Whether that outcome was merely personal or carried broader implications remains a matter of debate. Some investigators have expressed the belief that Werner Pinsner knew more than he ever revealed. If that assessment is correct, then some of the most important details concerning Hamburg's underworld disappeared with him on July 29, 1986. Decades later, the Werner Pinsner case continues to occupy a unique place in German criminal history. Germany has seen numerous notorious murder cases involving figures such as Fritz Haarmann, Joachim Kroll, and Peter Kürten. Yet Pinsner's story differs in a crucial respect. His notoriety stems not only from the murders attributed to him, but also from the extraordinary manner in which his story ended. Few criminal cases culminate inside police headquarters. Fewer still trigger a crisis of public confidence on a national scale. The case serves as a reminder that organized crime is rarely confined to dark alleyways and hidden meeting rooms. Its effects can reach courts, prisons, police departments, and political institutions. It can expose vulnerabilities where society least expects them. It can reveal the consequences of misplaced trust. Looking back, the story of Werner Pinsner is not merely the story of a suspected contract killer. It is the story of a city confronting violence within its criminal underworld. It is the story of investigators pursuing answers through fear and silence. It is the story of victims whose lives were consumed by conflicts rooted in power and profit. And it is the story of an investigation that came within reach of revealing the truth, only to lose it in a matter of seconds. The tragedy at Berliner Tor demonstrated that institutions, no matter how powerful, remain vulnerable to human error. It demonstrated that confidence can become dangerous when it replaces caution. Most importantly, it demonstrated that some mysteries survive not because nobody searches for answers, but because the answers disappear before they can be spoken. In the end, Werner Pinsner left behind more than a list of victims. He left behind a silence filled with unanswered questions, unfinished investigations, and possibilities that can never be fully tested. The murders that brought authorities to his door were shocking. The violence that occurred inside police headquarters was even more so. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the case is neither the killings nor the scandal. It is the realization that at the moment investigators believed they were closest to the truth slipped beyond their reach forever. And that is where the story remains today, suspended between what is known, what is suspected, and what may never be discovered. Years after the deaths inside Hamburg police headquarters, the city continued to move forward. Streets that once served as the backdrop to violent rivalries remained crowded. Businesses opened and closed. New generations arrived with little memory of the fear that had gripped St. Pauli during the mid-1980s. Time, as it often does, gradually softened the immediate shock of the events. Yet the Werner Pinsner case never completely disappeared from public memory. Some criminal investigations are remembered because of the brutality of the crimes. Others are remembered because of the mystery surrounding them. The Pinsner case occupies a rare position where both elements exist simultaneously. On one hand, it involved a series of murders linked to the criminal underworld of Hamburg. On the other, it ended with a sequence of events so extraordinary that it became impossible to separate the crimes from the institutional failures that followed. Decades later, historians, journalists, investigators, and true crime researchers still return to the case for the same reason. It represents a moment when organized crime, law enforcement, politics, and public trust collided with devastating consequences. Looking back, it is easy to focus on Werner Pinsner himself. His name appears in headlines. His actions drove the investigation. His final act transformed the course of the case. Yet focusing exclusively on him risks overlooking the broader lessons embedded within the story. The case was never solely about one man. It was about an environment that allowed violence to become a tool of business. It was about a criminal underworld in which disputes were increasingly settled through murder. It was about systems that struggled to keep pace with evolving forms of organized crime. Most importantly, it was about the people who paid the price. The victims connected to the murders often occupied complicated positions within society. Some lived within the criminal world that ultimately consumed them. Others, like prosecutor Wolfgang Bistry, stood on the opposite side of that divide. Yet despite their differences, they became linked by the same chain of events. Their lives were drawn into a conflict that extended far beyond any single confrontation. The consequences reached families, colleagues, witnesses, and communities. Every murder created a circle of grief. Every unanswered question prolonged uncertainty. Every failure to uncover the complete truth left another wound that could never fully heal. One of the enduring characteristics of the Pinsner case is the contrast between certainty and uncertainty. Certain facts are well established. Investigators connected multiple murders through evidence. Witnesses provided crucial testimony. Authorities arrested Werner Pinsner. A firearm was recovered. On July 29, 1986, prosecutor Wolfgang Bistry, Jutta Pinsner, and Werner Pinsner died inside police headquarters. These facts form the foundation of the historical record. Yet surrounding those facts are questions that remain unresolved. Who exactly ordered the murders? How extensive was the criminal network behind them? Did Pinsner possess information that could have implicated additional individuals? Were there crimes connected to him that investigators never had the opportunity to fully examine? These uncertainties continue to fuel discussion because they highlight a fundamental reality of criminal investigations. Not every question receives an answer. Popular culture often presents investigations as journeys toward complete resolution. Detectives gather clues, suspects are identified, trials occur, and mysteries are solved. Real life is often far messier. Vittnesestie. Evidence disappears. Opportunities are missed. Sometimes the person holding the most important information is no longer alive to provide it. In the Werner Pinsner case, that reality became impossible to ignore. The investigation reached a point where answers seemed within reach. Then, suddenly they were gone. This aspect of the story remains particularly haunting. Authorities believed they were approaching a breakthrough. They expected names. They expected revelations. They expected clarity. Instead, they encountered silence. The result was not merely the loss of evidence. It was the loss of possibility. Entire lines of inquiry ended before they could be pursued. Potential suspects were never publicly identified through Pinsner's testimony. Allegations that might have been examined in court remained unresolved. The investigation continued. But it continued without the one source of information investigators had considered most valuable. The consequences of that loss extended beyond the criminal justice system. Public confidence suffered as well. Trust is one of the most important assets any institution possesses. Citizens trust police to maintain security. They trust prosecutors to pursue justice. They trust correctional systems to manage dangerous offenders responsibly. The Pinsner case forced many people to question those assumptions. How could such a security breach occur? Why were warning signs apparently missed? Could the tragedy have been prevented? These questions became part of a larger conversation regarding accountability and institutional responsibility. In that sense, the case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a cautionary tale. It demonstrated that even experienced professionals can make assumptions that later prove catastrophic. It demonstrated that systems designed to protect the public can still contain vulnerabilities. And it demonstrated that the consequences of those vulnerabilities can be profound. For students of criminal history, The case also offers insight into the nature of organized crime during a particular period in German history. The violence associated with St. Pauli during the early 1980s did not emerge in isolation. It developed within a specific economic and social context. Competition intensified. Financial pressures increased. Rivalries escalated. As legitimate opportunities narrowed, criminal actors fought more aggressively to protect their interests. Understanding that context does not excuse the violence, but it helps explain how such violence became possible. Crime rarely emerges from a vacuum. It develops within environments shaped by incentives, pressures, and opportunities. The St. Pauli conflicts of the 1980s provide a clear example of that reality. Another reason the case continues to attract attention is the symbolism of its ending. Most murders occur in places associated with danger. Dark streets, isolated buildings, criminal meeting places. The deaths of July 29, 1986 occurred somewhere entirely different. They occurred inside a police headquarters. The symbolism is impossible to ignore. A building intended to represent security instead became the scene of violence. A location associated with control instead became a place where control was lost. That contrast remains one of the most striking aspects of the entire story. It transformed the case from a major criminal investigation into a historical event remembered across Germany. Today, Werner Pinsner's name remains associated with one of the most notorious criminal cases in modern German history. Yet history remembers him for reasons that extend beyond the murders attributed to him. It remembers him because his story exposed weaknesses in institutions that believe themselves secure. It remembers him because his death prevented investigators from obtaining the answers they sought. And it remembers him because the final chapter of the case unfolded in a manner almost no one could have predicted. In many true crime stories, the ending arrives with a verdict. A courtroom reaches a conclusion. A sentence is imposed. The legal process provides a sense of finality. The Werner Pinsner case offers something different. There was no definitive courtroom resolution. There was no final testimony explaining everything. There was no complete account of what happened behind the scenes of Hamburg's criminal underworld. Instead, there was a sudden ending that left investigators, victims' families, and the public confronting uncertainty. Perhaps that is why the case continues to resonate. It reminds us that justice and truth, while related, are not always the same thing. A criminal investigation can identify a suspect without uncovering every answer. A case can close officially while questions remain open historically. And sometimes, the most significant mysteries are not the ones investigators failed to solve, but the ones they nearly solved before circumstances intervened. The story of Werner Pinsner ultimately stands as a reminder of the limits of certainty. Investigators worked diligently. Witnesses came forward. Evidence was collected. Progress was made. Yet despite all of that effort, some answers remained forever out of reach. The final gunshots inside Berliner Tor ended more than 3 lives. They ended opportunities to learn the full truth. They ended possibilities that may never be recovered. And they ensured that the case would be remembered not only for what investigators discovered, but also for what they never had the chance to know. As the years continue to pass, that silence remains. It lingers in unanswered questions, in unresolved theories, and in the historical record itself. The violence has long since ended. The people involved are gone. The investigation belongs to history. Yet the mystery survives. And sometimes in true crime, that is the most unsettling ending of all.